Terrence McNally. Welcome to Free Forum, a world that just might work. And I'm going to be speaking today with climate scientist Michael Mann and physician scientist Peter HOTEZ about the book they've co-written, Science Under Siege. And you can learn more at Michael Mann. That's Michael Mann, one word, MANN.net. So he's at .net. And Peter HOTEZ, Peter, and then again, one word, Peter HOTEZ, HOTEZ, he's at .org, okay? michaelmann.net, peterhotez.org. On Free Forum, we explore the lives, the work, the ideas of individuals that I suspect are pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at politics, environment, science, health, culture, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. The show plays weekly on the Progressive Voices Network on TuneIn.com, and podcasts are available anytime, anywhere on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, most major podcast sites, and at my site, Terrence McNally, TERRENCEMCNALLY.net, TerrenceMcNally.net. Michael Mann has been a guest in this show more than once, most recently in 2021 on his book, The New Climate War, in which he made a point that climate denial was no longer possible. Real-world events now make the truth too obvious to people. So the fossil fuel industry and all who depend on it are developing and pushing new tactics to delay or disable our energy transition. I became familiar with Peter HOTEZ, MD, through his many appearances on cable news during the pandemic, and I found him a trusting presence and a good communicator. So it made sense when I learned they'd written a book together, rooted, as it is, in their personal experiences as targets of threatening abuse for practicing and communicating science in the public square and for the public good. From pandemics to the climate crisis, humanity faces tougher challenges than ever. Whether it's the health of our people or of our planet, we know we're on unsustainable paths. But our efforts to effectively tackle these existential crises are hampered by a common threat, politically and ideologically, and I would say also financially motivated opposition to science itself. Today's guests have spent the last 20 years on the front lines of the battle to convey accurate, reliable, trustworthy information about science in the face of this determined and even nihilistic opposition. In their book together, they cite 5 main forces threatening science: plutocrats, professionals, petrostates, propagandists, and the press. And of course, as you see it conveniently lined up as 5 Ps, calling on hard-won lessons, they offer a path, there's a 6th P, forward to repel the destructive attack so that we may effectively take on our critical challenges. Now, the subtitle of Science Under Siege is How to Fight the 5 Most Powerful Forces That Threaten Our World. And I read that to say, 1, our world is threatened by those who would destroy, disdain, or deny science. 2, the climate crisis and the possibility of future pandemics are existential threats, and we are dependent on science for our most effective responses to both. 3, there are 5 primary forces driving the siege on science. 4, we will name those forces and flesh them out. And 5, this is a fight, and we will offer battle plans. By the way, I'm an inveterate underliner or highlighter. And when I read in preparation for a conversation like this, I mark sentences and passages that I find especially compelling or that I think I might be worth quoting, you know? This book, I will tell you both, was outrageously underlinable. But what I find most alarming about the book is that it went to press in early 2025. Most of the worst attacks on nature and science from the Trump administration that I, or a reader of the book, or a listener to this conversation might immediately think of when they hear Science Under Siege, most of those hadn't even happened yet. Michael E. Mann is Presidential Distinguished Professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Science at the University of Pennsylvania and Director of the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media. His work focuses on Earth's climate system and the science impacts and policy implications of human-caused climate change. He's authored more than 300 scientific papers and 7 books. Mann contributed to the award of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize and was elected to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences in 2020. Peter J. HOTEZ is Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine and Professor of Pediatrics and Molecular Virology and Microbiology at Baylor College of Medicine, where he is also the director of the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development. He's an internationally recognized physician-scientist in the areas of neglected tropical diseases and the development of new vaccines for these conditions. He's also the author of 700 scientific papers and 5 books, and an elected member of the U.S. National Academy of Medicine. In 2022, HOTEZ was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on the COVID-19 vaccine. Welcome Michael Mann and Peter HOTEZ to Freeform, a world that just might work.
Thanks, Terrence. It's great to be with you. And it's always good to be here with my good friend, Peter.
Absolutely. Same, Michael and Terrence.
Thank you both. And let me tell listeners, we're recording this conversation Tuesday, April 28th, 2026. So, Michael, you may remember this. I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas we talk about. So I like people to tell us in your own words briefly how you see your path. We've got an hour, so how you see your path to the work you do and the life you lead today. And you can go way back, childhood inspirations, mentors, turning points. Just kind of give us a sense of how you got to kind of what I put out in your bios.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I sort of loved science. I loved exploring and trying to understand the natural world from the earliest days that I can remember. I was inspired by figures like Carl Sagan and his series Cosmos in the early 1980s. Sort of grew up excited about science, drawn to science in part because of the passion that Carl Sagan sort of infused in me. And little did I know that I would end up, as Peter would, following a somewhat similar path in that I started out simply as a scientist because I loved doing science. And when our work came to prominence in the late 1990s, when my co-authors and I published the so-called hockey stick curve that sort of laid bare the reality and threat of human-caused climate change, it was a very compelling visual that demonstrated just how unprecedented the warming of our planet is in a long-term context. We went back 1,000 years, the shape of the curve, sort of the handle is the small changes until the Industrial Revolution, and the blade is that sharp uptick in temperatures. When the hockey stick sort of became this symbol in the climate change debate in the late 1990s and early 2000s, I found myself under attack, under assault by individuals, groups, organizations, front groups, often connected to the fossil fuel industry or connected to billionaire fossil fuel plutocrats. And there was a concerted effort to sort of discredit my science and to discredit me personally in an effort to sort of undermine public faith in the science that's so inconvenient, that was so inconvenient to those bad actors, to the fossil fuel industry, the science that demonstrates that our burning of fossil fuels is warming the planet and creating all of these problematic changes in our climate. And so I was sort of forced into the public arena. As I like to say, I didn't come to politics, politics came to me. But ultimately, I would grow to embrace the role that provided me, the opportunity that provided me to be a participant in the larger conversation about one of the greatest challenges we face as a civilization, the climate crisis. And so that's how I sort of, my origin story, if you will, from sort of a mild-mannered scientist who just wanted to be left alone in the laboratory, coding, doing calculations, figuring out the solutions to problems. It's the stuff I love doing, but I realized that there was a larger role that I needed to try to play, which was to inform the public discourse over science and the lessons of the science, and in some ways that parallels, I think, sort of my good friend Peter HOTEZ's experiences.
Yeah, let me just make two observations. One, I think you were making the connection there, but the fact that one of the inspirations to you was not a scientist in the lab, but a scientist communicator.
That's right.
And then you become both a scientist in the lab and a scientific communicator.
That's right. I think Sagan had planted that seed, and it would ultimately germinate. And Peter again, and I'll just say, when we sort of became friends about 5 years ago during the early stages of the pandemic, when scientists like Peter and Tony Fauci were finding themselves under attack, again because of the inconvenient nature of their science. And I'll pass it along to Peter here.
Yeah. And then one other thing, and as I hand this off to you, Peter, is that what I also hear is that you begin, Michael, and I would think you too as well, Peter, in this book is the fruit of that, not only speaking for your particular focus of climate science or infectious diseases, but for science itself. Peter.
Yeah, it's actually a similar story, and I like Michael's statement. I didn't seek out the politics found me or found us, and in this case, I did my and what was called a combined MD and PhD program. This is for people who know they want to be biomedical scientists, and I actually knew I wanted to be a biomedical scientist making vaccines for global health. And I was in New York City at Weill Cornell Medical College on the Upper East Side of New York, right next to Rockefeller University. It used to be the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. And for my MD PhD thesis, I worked on a hookworm anemia vaccine that a month ago we just published in Lancet Infectious Diseases showing it actually works. So it took 40 years, but finally it did it. And along the way, made low-cost COVID vaccines that reached 100 million people. And that's what I wanted to do with my life. As I sometimes say, John Lennon says, life's what happens when you're busy making other plans in one of his songs. And that's what happened. I met my wife, Ann, 40 years ago in New York. And to tell you how long ago that was, I remind people that we lived at Rockefeller Institute housing for $44 a month on the Upper East Side of New York. That's how long ago it was. And we have 4 kids, including Rachel, who now they're adults, including Rachel has autism and intellectual disabilities. And if you remember, the original assertion against vaccines was that vaccines cause autism, which never made sense to me based on what I knew about autism. And Rachel not only has autism but intellectual disabilities. And we ultimately did genomic sequencing on Rachel. My wife Ann and I found her autism gene. And then about a decade ago, I received a request from the National Institutes of Health from Dr. Fauci and Francis Collins saying, Peter, you're pretty good at explaining why vaccines do not cause autism, and you're a pediatrician and a scientist. We're going to have you talk to Bobby Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And so I had a year of discussions with him on cell phone and I think Zoom, and you can see I was not very successful, but looking up all of his nonsense and debunking it and going to the biomedical literature, doing the PubMed database, the National Library of Medicine, I compiled all these notes to explain to him why vaccines don't cause autism and the scientific evidence for it and the genetic basis of autism. And he wasn't interested in listening, but before I knew it, I had a pile of notes, and I turned it into a book, and that was called Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism. And that wound up making me a public enemy with those who were monetizing the internet, selling wellness products, and those who were using this for political motivation. And so it was I became a public enemy, and to this day. And I think it was in 2023 when there was a big pile-on with to have me debate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in public.
Oh, right.
In a very performative kind of thing, which I thought I wasn't going to do because I'd already spoken to him for a year and knew he has no interest in the science or the facts. And what they really wanted me to do was platform him and make him seem like an important person and a serious person, and he wasn't. And help his presidential candidacy. He was running for president at that time, and I wasn't going to buy into that. And I said, it's send the wrong message how we do science, because that's not what we do for science. For science, we write our scientific papers and our grant applications and scientific meetings. We don't do this through performative debates with people who have no interest in science. That's not how science is done. Anyway, there was a big pile on.
And let me just cut in for 1 second, Peter, to just expand a little on what you say when you be a big pile on. Joe Rogan offered you $100,000 if you would debate Kennedy, and then other people came. I'll double that. I'll triple that. I mean, it was not just behind the scenes kind of
Although when I
thing.
looked them up, most of them have a track record of not paying their bills.
Right,
So
right,
so
right,
I didn't
right.
take that stuff too seriously. But
But
even
I'm just
so,
saying, it wasn't just a behind the scenes thing. This was
yeah.
a
And then
very public effort.
Elon Musk piled on and said, "What are you hiding?" and all this kind of nonsense. And it was really unpleasant. And I said, "What the heck's going on here?" And then I can't remember if I reached out to Michael or Michael reached out to me. But the bottom line was, Michael. I learned a lot from Michael because he had been through something similar a decade before with all the attacks on climate science, and we got to talking and realized that while if you sometimes the metaphor I use is think of the attacks on science and the attacks on biomedicine as two circles of a Venn diagram. They're not totally overlapping, but there is significant overlap. And we realized that this is an opportunity to really explain this whole anti-science ecosystem that it's not just random junk out there on the internet. It's not, misinformation or infodemic. It's organized, it's deliberate, it has political motivation, financial motivation, and hence the genesis of the book.
Yeah.
Very good, very good. By the way, I wanted to mention, just to tell you a little bit more about myself, that I had the opportunity to focus on cutting edge science and innovation when I worked as host and one of the producers of a 17-part podcast called Disruptive for and with Harvard's Wyss Institute for Biologically Inspired Engineering.
Yeah.
We actually were honored by the Webbies of one of the best science podcasts of 2017. And the founding director of the Wyss Institute, Don Ingber, has, like yourselves, been one of the folks out there on the ramparts fighting, advocating for science research and against the cuts.
Yeah.
Are either of you familiar with them or with him? Or
I know the Institute, and it does a lot of innovative work, and this is sort of the cutting edge of biomedical science, the interface with engineering and nanotechnology, and of course now everything is AI fueled, and so it's really exciting. Not easy to keep up with, but really exciting.
Yeah. And so that was just a great experience for me. I had to be on my toes to deal with them. You looked like you were about to say something, Michael.
Yeah, well, I was just going to, point out that, literally every day there's a new development that really underscores the basic thesis of the book. The ways that that there is this larger attack on science itself, and as if to try to really drive that home, just within the last 48 hours. The Trump administration, or maybe it was late last Friday, all of the members of the National Board of Science, which basically is the oversight board for the National Science Foundation. They determine the funding priorities of the National Science Foundation. Every single member was summarily dismissed late Friday afternoon. That is one of the most disturbing developments yet, and it really harkens back to, as Peter and I talk about, the era of Lysenkoism in the Soviet Union earlier last century, and under Stalin, the way that there was basically state-sponsored anti-science, that the state determined which scientific theories were acceptable, which weren't, and scientists who didn't conform to the beliefs of Stalin and Lysenko, his sort of hand-appointed, if you will, the equivalent of the National Science Board for him. Lysenko was sort of in charge of science policy for the Soviet Union, and those who disagreed with him were actually jailed. And so, the developments that we're seeing now really drive home this analogy that Peter and I describe in the book, this analogy with what transpired during the era of Lysenkoism. I don't know, Peter, if you want to add.
Yeah, and now you're just seeing this pretty steady drumbeat of attacks, not only seeking to discredit the science, but discredit the scientist and portray us as public enemies or cartoon villains against the state. It has a very much Lysenko communist kind of ring to it, in a very eerie and a very scary way. And we talk about that some in the book. It's a very primitive way to implement authoritarian control, but it's
Right.
highly effective because it's part of a larger attack on the intelligentsia
Yeah.
and their so-called elites, even though their elites are trillionaires or
That's right.
multi-billionaires. I
Right,
mean,
right, right.
uh,
Their anti-elitists
that
are
their
billionaires.
elites against our elites, I
Yeah,
guess.
yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
but
it's, it's and that is the method of projection, right? That they accuse, their opponents of the very thing that they're guilty of. And that really describes so much of what we're seeing with this
Absolutely.
administration. Yeah.
and so I think what you're seeing now is, I think the attacks on vaccines on the biomedical side is just the foot in the door. I see,
Yeah.
you see
Yeah.
efforts to dismantle the major biomedical journals like New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA. You're seeing cuts in funding to the medical schools and the academic health centers. And you're seeing this in its place, you're seeing this kind of whole pseudoscience universe rise up through the wellness and influencer industry of, as I often say, you ever wonder why they're all anti-parasitic drugs, hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, fenbendazole? It's because you can buy them in bulk and they're cheap generics, and you can then repackage it, jack up the price, and you sell it with an expensive telehealth visit. It's a very corrupt business, but to make all that stuff work, you've got to discredit the mainstream science, including vaccines. And you're
Well,
and
also,
I see that with Kennedy, when I talked to him a decade ago, the one difference between then and now, most of his talking points are the same, but the new talking points are, he'll say, well, during our measles epidemic, or you can, instead of getting vaccinated, you can get an infusion of vitamin A, budesonide, and clarithromycin. And you're like,
Right.
where'd that come from? And then you realize this is all the wellness influencer industry.
yeah,
So
let me just say a
it is
couple
a whole alternative world of pseudoscience now being actively promoted.
I
couple
would
of
just jump in for 1 second
sure.
and emphasize, as Peter's saying, in the book, we talk a lot about the assault on public health science, on anti-vax movement. We talk a lot about the efforts to undermine climate science, but we do describe how it's part of something larger. And I think that this assault on the National Science Board, I think that really drives that home. It's really, of all of the actions he's taken so far, this most clearly telegraphs their intent to literally undermine science itself because, as Peter says, because science, there is objective truth. Scientists do speak truth to power because the science is a way of discerning what's factually true about our world, and that's a challenge for those who don't like the facts, those who feel their ideological or economic interests are threatened by the facts. And that's why we see the assault on science. That's why we see the assault on academia that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, no, it's a quote from your book I was going to bring up later, and I'm going to quote it right now. There is a reason that scientists find themselves directly in the crosshairs of bad actors. Scientists rank among the most trusted messengers in modern society and are seen to possess both authority and integrity. So, eroding trust in science, I'm still quoting, or equating scientific mainstream findings with propaganda makes it easier to diminish the veracity of just about everything
That's right.
else. So, science and scientists become a prime target. And it's interesting how I said, at first it begins for you, Peter, to be about vaccines or for you to be about hockey stick graphs. But then it's not just climate, it's not just infectious diseases, it's science itself. And then we realize it's not just science itself, it's truth, it's
That's right.
facts.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's
I
right.
mean, you see it in kind of the language of the leaders of the NIH and FDA. They make statements like, "Now we're going to restore gold standard science to the National Institutes of
Evidence
Health," or,
based.
or yeah, and it's all BS, right? Because those agencies have always practiced gold standard science. They've been the admiration of the world. What they really want to do is implement gold standard pseudoscience and create this alternative universe. And this is how the propagandists work. I mean, Hannah
Yep.
Arendt in her book *The Origins of Totalitarianism*, spelled it out for us. And the goal is not necessarily to believe the propaganda; it's to confuse you so you don't know what to believe anymore, and that creates a vulnerability that allows the authoritarians to come in. And
Yep.
it's not fun to go up against this stuff. I started to read about Nikolai Vavilov, the Mendelian geneticist, who went up against Lysenko, was thrown
Yeah.
into the Gulag, and ultimately died in a prison hospital from starvation. Um, because this is where it could go, and we're seeing prosecutions of scientists and attacks on scientists. So it's
Just today, Peter, you probably saw they're trying to go after Tony Fauci now over this claim that they defied FOIA
yeah, I know
laws.
it's all very dark and
Very
deeply
dark,
and
very
deeply
dark. I mean,
deeply troubling.
Kennedy wrote that book about Fauci. I'm forgetting the name of the book.
Oh, he talked about, and he made up all the stuff about me as well in the book, and it's
And
the
basically says, he should be arrested, prosecuted, jailed, perhaps even eliminated. I mean, it's really strong stuff. That he is he is a deep, dark criminal, and his crime has been science.
Well, Elon Musk with his, my pronouns are prosecute Fauci, right?
Yeah. And let me just say, I just wanted to share briefly. I first ran into Robert F. Kennedy Jr. when he was an environmental attorney.
Sure.
He was a guest. He was a guest on this show talking about river keepers and water keepers. And
Terrence,
I met him.
He even had his own radio show. He was at one of the co-hosts of Ring of Fire Radio, and I did several
on Air America. Yeah.
Yes, and I did several interviews with him, and he was hard hitting. He was all about taking down the climate deniers, taking them to task. And we talk about Elon Musk as an example of this. There's so many examples of these individuals who have undergone these Bond villain-like arcs. And RFK Jr., well, there was always a problem with his anti-vax views, but he wasn't the Bond villain writ large that he is now. There were areas in which he was doing constructive work.
Yeah,
I mean, I remember a decade.
Let me just say that in 2024, when he was running for president, people pitched me. I can get you Bobby Kennedy. I can get you. Yeah. And just like you guys, I'm not going to do that. Yeah. You can't do an interview with someone when half of what they say is lies, because you can't keep up. And for you guys, as you point out, it wouldn't be so much in my case that I would be platforming him. It's a podcast.
Yeah, and half is pretty generous, by the way.
But that point that they say is if I think you make the point, Peter, that if you appear on stage with him, it's 50-50, and you're fighting for the rest of the time to get back to the
that's what Michael explained to me exactly.
Yeah, I see it as if you want to get a little nerdy here, Bayesian statistics is a reframing of statistics where you build in your prior information. You don't start. You start off not with total ignorance, but you have some prior information, and there are ways to make that statistically rigorous. That you bring that to the table, and that helps you refine, your statistical estimates of the likelihood of some phenomenon. And what I liken it to is you've introduced the prior of 50-50. You start out with the notion that these are two equally valid positions. One, which is actually the view of the vast preponderance of scientists, and one that is, crackpot theories that are advanced by bad actors and crackpots. And you put them on an equal footing. That's where you start out. And then your job as the scientist is to somehow try to work back over the course of the debate to where the balance of evidence actually lies, which isn't 50-50, it's 99.999, whatever you want to. And I think that's a reasonable analogy for what's going on here.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember 10 years ago, and I was talking to him, I would actually explain to him that there are known environmental exposures in pregnancy that will interact with autism genes and give you an autism phenotype. And I went through 3 or 4 of those, and I said, Bobby, back then I was calling him Bobby. I won't tell you what he was calling me, but, I said, Bobby, you're an environmental attorney. This is your moment. This is your sweet spot. You should be all over this. And he couldn't care less. He was all focused on vaccines. And then, he pulls this stunt in the White House last September about Tylenol, which it was never on the list. And and is not a risk factor. It's again, it's this whole effort to create this pseudoscience universe.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and there's so many pieces of that, which is the sort of the adaptation of Bannon's Flood the Zone
Exactly.
to any of these conversations, right? He will
Exactly.
throw out Kennedy or others of his ilk, Mercola, folks like that, will
Yeah.
throw out statistics, because statistics sound real.
Right. They
and
throw
and,
as
and
much mud on the walls as they can,
that's
and you
right.
have to try to scrape it all off. And they bring that advantage to the table. When one, you have an honest actor going up against a dishonest actor, the dishonest actor has an advantage in a forum where there isn't fact checking and there's no true arbiter of what's true and what isn't.
What's
That's right. And it
interesting
is
is
even difficult.
in their rhetoric, they're using more and more scientific terms to make it
Exactly.
sound
Exactly.
sciency. The
Exactly.
example I like to give is the Florida Surgeon General, Dr. Ladapo, who's an ardent anti-vaccine activist, says mRNA vaccines are causing turbo cancers. Why? Because the lipid nanoparticle is introducing foreign nucleic acid that's interacting with our genome next to oncogenes. And it sounds very sciencey, right? But it's all made up. It's all BS. I mean, there's no such thing as a turbo cancer, number one. Number two, the lipid nanoparticle will get nucleic acid past the cell membrane into the cytoplasm. But to get things to the nuclear membrane into the nucleus is work. You have to do electroporation, and then we have interferon-inducible elements of our innate immune system that block integration of foreign nucleic acid. Otherwise, every time we ate a hamburger, we'd have cow DNA into our genome, and that doesn't happen. And so it's easy to debunk, but you need time and you need access. And the problem is, I mean, I remember when I was publicly debunking that, what happened? Our mutual friend, Ali Velshi on what was then MSNBC,
Yeah.
now MS Now, had me on. I think Chris Hayes, maybe CNN, and it was great to go on, but guess where I wasn't being invited? I wasn't being invited on Fox News and Joe Rogan podcast. So that whole world is sort of
It's hermetically sealed.
hermetically
Well,
sealed, and so you can't really reach the people that you probably most need to reach.
well, as you said, it's easy. It was funny. You said it's easy to debunk. Well, it's easy for what? A few scientists to debunk. But the
Right.
public who hears
Right.
that, that's like fancy dancing, right? I mean,
That's right.
look at my moves.
Well, this is
Eh,
sort of why the public polling, people are surprised, for example, that that Donald Trump has as much support as he still has, in the probably somewhere in the mid 30s if you look at sort of the average of the reliable polls, and and it never seems to drop below that, and a lot of people find that puzzling. It's like, with all of these revelations that are coming out, how do these people still stand by him? The point is, they don't know about these revelations. They're not hearing what we're hearing. They're not exposed to the facts. They are being Fox News is the conduit through which all of their information is flowing. And if that's where you're getting your information, then black is white, up is down. It is a bizarro world where science and facts no longer matter. All that matters is how compelling the rhetoric of their hosts actually is. And that's what we're dealing with. And we're not going to see those numbers change substantially until we deal, and Peter and I get into this, we've got to deal with this anti-science ecosystem. There have to be common sense regulations of the big tech firms, social media. Without some sort of guardrails, we're going to continue to have about a third of the public that is completely weaponized against facts and evidence, and that's going to make it really hard for us to make any progress on any of these challenges we face.
Right. It is in some sense the downside of democracy is that 30% is a lot. I've been dealing with minority rule and threats to democracy so much that I find myself often quoting what Astra Taylor taught me, which was Plato's dilemma. Plato said way back, in that old democracy, that democracy inevitably leads to tyranny. He said,
right.
if you allow people to be free, the greedy will never stop being greedy, and eventually a demagogue will tell the masses, only I can stop their greed, and
That's
you
right.
will end up with tyranny. And it's just,
And
you'll see it.
Einstein wrote about this in the 1930s. He wrote an essay about how a market economic system will ultimately lead to the accumulation of power among a small number of actors who will buy, in a market system, they can buy the media, and they will weaponize the media for their purposes. And guess what? Yeah, he saw it coming. Carl Sagan saw it coming. The prophetic words in A Demon Haunted World about a future where people are unable to even understand the technology that rules their world, and how they will become vulnerable to, again, to bad actors looking to sort of mislead them and weaponize them for their agenda. And all of those, Isaac Asimov, so many great thinkers.
And the one I'll also throw in, which was to another sort of angle on this, was Neil Postman, amusing ourselves to death.
Yeah, yeah,
That
yeah.
that once we fall prey to entertainment, and I guess Brave New World kind
Yep.
of made the same point,
Yep.
that we become
Yep.
passive recipients of life rather than actors. Let me tell people, this is Free Forum, a world that just might work. I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking with climate scientist Michael Mann and physician scientist Peter HOTEZ about the book they've co-written, Science Under Siege. And you can learn more at michaelmann.net, and that's Michael, M-A-N-N, one word, michaelmann.net. And Peter HOTEZ, that's Peter at one word, HOTEZ.org. Let me ask one question that if we got to the end and I hadn't asked it, I'd feel I'd failed, which is, how do you deal with tension between credible skepticism, which is a core value of science, and these unfounded critiques? It seems to me it's a real challenge, because not only is it difficult to do, which I'm going to, but it also is one of the angles of attack, right?
Yeah.
Is that, so how do you guys handle that tension?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to, provide some
start,
thoughts. I'm
Michael.
sure Peter has thoughts as well. We already talked about sort of this method of projection, where the bad actors that we talk about in the book, the petrostates, the plutocrats, the pros and propagandists, and too often members of the press, the conservative press, but even the the prestige or legacy media that too often engage in performative neutrality, providing
Both sidism,
yeah, both
exactly, that fake
sidesism, exactly,
objectivity.
exactly. And so, they have been very effective at sort of, in using sort of the sort of tool of projection, where you basically accuse, again, your opponent of all the things you're guilty of, and part of this sort of facade of sciency language that they surround themselves with. And you see that in intelligent design, for example, creationism, sort of, dressing up as the more scientific sort of, movement of intelligent design. They've become very skilled at using the language, creating what my colleague Naomi Oreskes has called a Potemkin village of what looks to be authoritative and sciency, but it's all just a shallow, thin veneer of sciency language on top of nonsense, so anti-science nonsense, and it's very difficult for the public to figure out which is which, and they prevail. In that sort of environment of uncertainty, they can't figure out who's right, and so that's what we see going on here.
But there is a healthy skepticism. There
So
is a
yeah,
credible. There
exactly.
is. I mean,
Sorry. So yeah, yeah,
science. I think
yeah,
I'm forgetting who said it, but one of
yeah.
one of my guests once said, "Science is not settled. Science is a verb."
Yeah, so
you know?
so no, you're exactly right, and so they'll take that fact that the real skepticism, of course, is something that we hold up as part of the self-correcting machinery of science, as Carl Sagan described it. So critical, and the more profound the claim, the more extraordinary the claim, the more extraordinary the evidence has to be, right? And so that's all part of that machinery as well, and that's where you really see the sleight of hand that they're using here, because what they're calling skepticism isn't this equal-sided scrutiny that you apply to all facets of the problem, poking it and seeing where, the weaknesses are. That's not what they're doing. What they're engaged in is a sort of one-sided skepticism where they are rejecting, the overwhelming consensus of the world's scientists based on the flimsiest of arguments that don't that don't stand up to the slightest bit of scrutiny, and that is not skepticism. It's denialism.
And then you immediately get a whiff of what's going on. The minute you challenge it, then come the attacks, right? And all of a sudden, we're criminals or cartoon villains,
Right, and they're waving the flag of they wave the flag of freedom, right? Freedom of information, freedom of practice, freedom and that
freedom to
somehow,
pollute. Freedom to pollute is what they're engaged in. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I say, because I saw
Yeah,
this in
Peter.
some of the Fox News talking heads, and that some were, professors at major medical centers like Stanford and Johns Hopkins, and the chyron underneath said Johns Hopkins or
Exactly.
Stanford, and although they weren't experts in vaccines or infectious diseases, completely different areas, in some cases,
But
that
seemingly authoritative,
but
and that's
seemingly
the
authoritative,
yeah.
and that was extreme. Those, we talk about this in our book. We call them the pros, the professionals, that do this,
They
and
launder their credentials to promote, nonsense. Right?
I had one, professor at Stanford who's an economist, go after me, and he said, "Well, of course, HOTEZ is in the secret cabal with Fauci, because he has funding from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases." And I said, "Well, hell, your whole microbiology department at Stanford is funded by NIAID, so it's very dark and cynical." And
It'd be like saying,
and
he's funded by the National Science Foundation, so clearly he's part of the. I mean, that's where all the funding comes for the work we do. So
yeah,
it's
yeah. And then, they would also do a lot of conflation. So, they'd be outraged about vaccine mandates, for instance. And I would say, look, I supported the mandate, but I understand the objection as well. And I think you could have a reasonable public discussion, maybe because it's not science, it's policy, right? Around the necessity of mandates. So, you had at the CPAC conference of conservatives, you had, Representative Matthew Cawthorn come down from North Carolina and say something to the effect of, first they're going to vaccinate you, then they're going to take away your guns and your Bibles. And you're like, oh, jeez. But
just like those.
The slip,
it's
Just
annoying.
like those. Yeah.
slow.
It's
I was going
annoying
to say, yeah.
It's annoying as hell, but
Yeah.
okay, fair enough. You can have that discussion, but that's not the problem. The problem was they then put out a whole parade of dyed-in-the-wool anti-vaccine activists to falsely discredit the effectiveness and safety of the COVID vaccines, and that's where it crossed the line. And then Fox News did the same thing every night during the Delta wave that we documented in the book. Laura Ingraham, Sean Hannity, Tucker Carlson push back against mandates. Okay, I'm not happy about it, but fair enough. It's something you can have a discussion about. But then the toxic talking heads to discredit the effectiveness. And Rogan did the same thing on his podcast and pushing his ivermectin. And that's where it crossed the line. But to us it's not subtle, but I think to the country it was probably subtle. And how you have that discussion is complicated.
Yeah, and I wanted to just follow up.
Let me just say one thing, Michael, before, and because I want to emphasize this for listeners, that it's very obvious the financial motivation behind the attacks on responding to the climate crisis, because the fossil fuel industry is public enemy number one in that case. But I think what you've done a good job, Peter, is pointing out why the attacks on vaccines and public health policy and so on also makes sense. And it's two things. One, I think that we've talked about. One is it allows you to attack all of science and thus all of truth and and that.
That's right.
But the other is that it's not as large as the fossil fuel industry, but there is a big industry in the fake cures.
Yeah, and let me just, and there's one other element there, and it brings the two things together because very early on during the pandemic, when when we were being, people were being faced with sort of social distancing requirements, mask wearing. There was a pretty dramatic decrease in transportation, people staying in their homes. It was leading to a huge drop in fossil fuel usage, and it was hurting the profits of the fossil fuel industry. And the largest privately held fossil fuel interest, Koch Industries, the Koch brothers, who fund so much of the climate denial, libertarian, billionaires who profit from fossil fuels, have funded much of the climate denial infrastructure. Many of the front groups, many of the talking heads that you see out there are connected to the Koch brothers, or funded by the Koch brothers. But they saw the public health sort of messaging as hurting their bottom line. It was hurting they wanted people out there driving their cars, burning fossil fuels. And so they funded some of these early anti-science outfits like the Brownstone Institute, which would ultimately become part of the larger anti-vax messaging echo chamber as well. And so there was that connection. And the one other thing I was going to say earlier was another connection between these two things. We talk about it. In the case of COVID, it's these scientists who are taking away your personal freedom. They won't let you leave your homes, and they use that as red meat for their base, a base that values liberty. And you tell them that these scientists, these evil scientists, are going to take away your personal liberty. It plays right to sort of the tribal identity of the base that they're trying to fire up. And you see the same thing with climate change and with fossil fuels. They immediately pivoted to, and by the way, you're not going to be able to eat a hamburger or fly to see grandma during the holidays, and you're going to be subject to climate lockdowns if these scientists have their way. So it all comes together.
Yep, it does. Now, one thing that we've danced around, but we haven't quite done, and I'm going to throw it to you to start, Peter, because I've been giving Michael so much time, is the 5 Ps. How, just to lay them out for people: the plutocrats, the petrostates, the pros, the propagandists, and the press.
Well, first of all, up front, it was Michael's idea, the 5 Ps. That was his brilliance. So, as soon as he said it, I said, yes, this totally makes sense, and I was all in. So I'll do a couple of them, and then
Toss it over, yeah.
I think one of the first ones we talk about are the plutocrats, the very high net worth individuals, and we contrast the plutocrats of today versus the plutocrats of the early 20th century. Now, some of them were the robber barons, in coal and energy. You had Rockefeller and Carnegie and Mellon and people like that. But they all ultimately, supported universities, named incredibly prestigious universities after themselves, and did some good in the world. And then, fast forward to people who started out okay, but then decided to use their wealth and power to attack science and scientists. And of course, the poster child for that was Elon Musk, and who remains for me an enigmatic character. I mean, here, he's got SpaceX, which is a very science-driven organization, and yet he's created X to create this platform for full-on attacks against science and scientists, and he himself targeted me and others. And so trying to understand that plutocrat space, I think, was really eye-opening. Another one was the petrostates, which, as you point out, the attacks on the climate science for some of the petrostates like Saudi or Russia, that's sort of, it was awful, but it made sense, right? And I mean, they were hurting the bottom line. What was interesting, how these petrostates also, in many cases, would attack biomedical science, like what Putin did to attack vaccines. And this is well documented, how he would use this to divide democracies with his Russian bots and trolls. and others as well. And so that was really eye-opening. And one, and in one case you had the Saudis, which are in this case they were really up pushing back on the climate science and doing everything they could to undermine it. But in the biomedical science space, they were pretty good. But that was a rare exception where there was a divergence.
Yeah, and I would just, add to what Peter said. As we talk about the plutocrats, Elon Musk, this Bond villain like Ark. He was once a champion of clean energy, and now look what he's doing now. He's weaponizing his social media platform to attack climate science, to attack renewable energy, and it was leveraged, by the way. His purchase of Twitter was leveraged by Russia and Saudi Arabia. So there is this, there's a synergy between the petrostates and the plutocrats. There are the pros and the propagandists. Those are the people down in the trenches spreading the misinformation and disinformation. The primary distinction is whether they're paid for it or whether they're just part of some echo chamber and pumping out misinformation. And then, as we said, the press. And it's not just Fox News, the Murdoch media, the conservative media. It's the New York Times or the Washington Post when they platform the lab leak theory, which has no scientific support, on the eve of Tony Fauci's testimony to Congress. One can look at that. It's hard to look at that in any other way than a bad faith attempt on their part to display this sort of performative neutrality that maybe brings in more conservative readers, gets more clicks and page views for them, but at the expense of scientists and of science and of society itself,
and civilization
and society itself. Yep.
Yeah, we sort of we knew going we had to say it, to be honest. So we really sharply criticized the New York Times and Washington Post for what they did. Of course, it meant that our book wasn't reviewed by the New York Times and the Washington Post.
Is that true?
That is true.
I looked for reviews, but I didn't notice the ones that were missing.
Yeah,
the ones that were missing. Anything when we I don't regret it for a second, but
who would think that they could be so petty? Who would think that the New York Times and the Washington... Right. Actually, we all think they could be that petty.
Right. Exactly. We took ourselves out of the running for the New York Times bestseller list.
That's true. That's true. For the bestseller list or the awards. You kind of went over it quickly, but the pros and the propagandists are a team, and the pros are those people often with the credentials.
Yeah.
Who have, and this is what Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway did such a great job in their book,
Merchants of Doubt. Yeah.
Merchants of Doubt, which was people with apparent legitimacy, apparent credibility, apparent credentials, who then just sell out.
And they were talking mostly about the fossil fuel space, but as Peter's pointed out, you have something very equivalent now when it comes to vaccines and public health.
And so they are in some sense the pros, and then the propagandists are the influencers, etc., who will spread their mis and disinformation.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah. The other type of pro on the biomedical side were physicians who were trained as intensivists or you name whatever subspecialty of medicine they were. But then they decided to go into the wellness influencer industry and push the ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and their supplements, and they were pretty dangerous because they knew some knowledge of how to attack, and yet it was all about pushing the snake oil.
Okay, finally, the battle plan, the how do we fight back, and let me just preface it by saying some of the things you call for are a far way from happening. In other words, as we say, in the current political climate, etc.
Yeah.
But lay out what your call to arms is.
So I'll start out with sort of the big picture, and then there are sort of the larger systemic changes that are needed if we're fundamentally going to deal with this this existential threat of anti-scientific disinformation, especially with now the new weapons that bad actors have in the form of AI. It makes the challenge that much greater. And so, obviously, we need policies. We need laws that rein in the the big tech, social media companies. We need common sense regulations so that they're not allowed to, blanket the public with anti-science and disinformative propaganda. There need to be penalties. There need to be constraints. And we're not going to get that without politicians who are willing to support that. And that comes back to us. Obviously, we've got to turn out in elections, and we've got to elect policymakers who will act on our behalf rather than just be rubber stamps for the fossil fuel industry, for the big tech companies, the social media companies. And right now, obviously, we're seeing our media and social media being bought out by right-wing plutocrats under the Trump administration. That will need to be dealt with as well. There will need to be some sort of regulatory reform. And basically monopolies that'll need to be broken up, and the Trump administration isn't going to do it. So again, that's going to require political change. So the big picture, we need massive sort of political mobilization and the systemic change that can come with that. And it can seem like an insurmountable battle. We frame this. We were talking early on about Tolkien, and it's a Tolkien-esque battle between good and evil, and and some things are worth fighting for, as difficult as they might seem. And to quote very loosely, a line from the book, and that's true here. There is some reason for hope. Look at what happened in Hungary. It can happen. You can defeat authoritarianism. You can, when people rise up.
And by the way, you can defeat authoritarianism even in weakened democracy.
Exactly. Now, and it's going to take some time for them to restore the basic democratic infrastructure, and the scientific infrastructure and the universities and everything that was destroyed will need to be rebuilt, and that'll take some time. And we should, we shouldn't have any illusions here. The same will be true here. They have destroyed so much in less than a year. It's going to take some time for us to rebuild that. But then in the meantime, there are lots of other things that we can do. And I think, Peter really speaks to that very eloquently. The things that we scientists can do, for example, the educational community, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to train scientists to be better at public engagement and help them educate them about what this space is like, promoting science journalism. Too often I think we're invisible, and because the universities, especially the academic health centers, respond to all this by hunkering down and trying to make themselves invisible, and that's just enabling. So I think continuing to be out there is going to be extremely important, and if anything, promoting public communication skills. And not every scientist wants to do it, but we should make that available, and changing the metrics that we use at universities to advance people. If they want to engage in public discourse, reward them, and realize that we are under existential threat, and the world's under existential threat. I think the bottom line of the book, and the reason why I was so excited about it, is to tell the world that we have two reasons where the world could collapse: pandemics and climate change. But there's a third leg to that tripod, and that is the disinformation that's right now blocking our response. And at least let's start whittling away with that one.
Yep.
Okay, we're right near the end. Michael, I will let that be your final comment, Peter, and Michael, yours.
Yeah, that sounds good. I think we left it on the right note there, a note of very cautious optimism that we can fight this monster.
Okay. I'm really thankful for what you both have done.
Well,
and
thank you.
Also what may have been for either or both of you sort of an unwelcome transition from what you set out to do to what you feel called to do in terms of standing up for that science which you practice. And I
but there's
really
no, yeah. Well, thank you. There's
both of you.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not all in the past. It's still accelerating. So.
Yes. Oh, no. As I said, your book, I mean, one thing that people will see when they read your book is that, but they don't even, they don't even mention a lot of the very worst, like the one you pointed out.
Yeah, well,
happened
there will be, don't mention this because then people won't want to buy it. There will be a paperback coming out where we will update things. So yeah. there'll be an afterword.
It's gotta be.
Yeah.
Let me tell people, the book again is Science Under Siege, How to Fight the 5 Most Powerful Forces That Threaten Our World. The websites are michaelmann.net. Michael Mann, one word, MANN, michaelmann.net, and Peter HOTEZ, one word, HOTEZ.org. For this conversation and many other interviews and articles to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to terrencemcnally.net, TERRENCEMCNALLY.net, or a world that just might work.com to the same website. You can also get a weekly email from me by signing up there or emailing me at temcnally@mac.com, in which I'll tell you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and links to probably 10, 15, 20 articles that'll really flesh out the conversation. And you can subscribe and listen to the Freeform podcast at most of those podcast sites, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, et cetera, and at my site. The archives go back hundreds. I've been doing this for way too long. But Michael Lewis, Naomi Klein, Robert Reich, Van Jones, Bill McKibben, et cetera.
Impressive list.
Thanks to Keanu Williams in production, George Vasilopoulos at Progressive Voices, and most of all, you, my listeners, please share this podcast widely. And finally, thank you, Michael Mann and Peter HOTEZ. Keep up your good work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Terrence.
Really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure.